It's the Legendary Leader Award. Let's welcome Salim John Mohammed of Accenture, who will tee up that award. Salim?
Thanks, Geoffrey. Hello, I'm Salim John Mohammed, Senior Managing Director at Accenture. I'd like to start by congratulating the Churchill Club for their leadership and for continuing their these game-changing programs, which together create an amazing. I'd like to start by congratulating the Churchill Club for their leadership and for continuing to offer these game-changing programs, which bring together an amazing group of industry leaders. We're thrilled to be part of this. The Legendary Leader Award is about inspirational leadership and its contribution to the innovation of others' success. When the Churchill Club asked its Academy to nominate honorees for this award, they asked them to identify people who have seen and envisioned a brand new future, people who frame industry and societal needs and create solutions in a way that is uniquely their own. Of equal importance is the ability to recognize and develop talent and to catalyze great teams. We asked the legendary leader who has had enormous impact on the industry he or she served and through the contributions of the people they helped along the way. On behalf of Accenture, I'm so pleased to be here this evening and to have the distinct privilege of announcing that the 2015 Legendary Leader Award goes to Andy Grove, former Chairman and CEO of Intel. Let me welcome to the stage Ben Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz, who will be speaking on Andy's behalf tonight.
Thank you so much. There couldn't be a more aptly named award, I don't think. And we thought the best way to talk about a legendary leader would be through the eyes of his followers. So we're going to start with a video that takes us through some of the highlights of Andy's careers. Then I'm going to give my perspective on what he meant to me. And then we're going to show a final video with some other of Andy's many, many followers telling what he meant to them.
You have something of a kind of a team approach within Intel, don't you?
Very much so.
How does that
Can
work?
I butt in and ask you to pronounce it Intel?
Intel? What did I say?
Intel.
Intel. I stand corrected. I thank you very much. Yes. Thank you.
The company was started in 1968 at a time when it appeared that what at that point wasn't yet named LSI technology, silicon technology, has reached a level capable of putting a substantial amount of function onto a given chip.
The critical point that we defined where this transformation is ripe for action is what we like to call the strategic inflection point, where the forces have spoken up, they showed up, they presented themselves, and it's not too late yet. You probably realize that today is National Depression Screening Day. And one of the aspects of National Depression Screening Day is that no one needs to suffer in silence.
Thank you, Terry Murphy, for putting that video together. It is what amazing memories. So I read a tweet the other day, and it said, the greatest thing about Silicon Valley's culture is that you can ask someone for help, and they'll help you and won't expect anything in return. And when I read that, I thought, wow, that's really, really interesting, and in two ways. First, there aren't other business cultures that are like that. So if you think about Hollywood or Wall Street, you can ask someone for help, but the idea that you would get connections or advice or help and not have to pay that back, that's just not happening there. But the second thing, and even more importantly, is it's really fundamental to what Silicon Valley is, because Silicon Valley is fueled by new ideas. And new ideas generally come from new people, and new people often have nothing. And they come without anything, and the fact that they can get help and get help at no cost and get on their way is the thing that makes this the ecosystem for invention that's better than anywhere else in the world. And so I was thinking about that, and I thought, where did that come from? How do you get to a culture that's really, in a lot of ways, not in the kind of existing people's self-interest? How did that start? And I know how it started for me. Because when I got here in the late 80s, I really wanted to do something. I wanted to be like Elizabeth Holmes. I wanted to be great like that. I wanted to do something and be a leader. But at that time, there really was very little to go on. The internet, the World Wide Web wasn't around yet. And there were no blogs. And there were no TED Talks. And there was no way to learn this stuff. And most of the people in the industry were self-taught. And I knew from working for them that they weren't very good teachers or students. So when somebody told me that there was a book that taught all the nuts and bolts and everything you really needed to know how to build and run an organization, I was very excited about it. And they said, the name of this book is High Output Management. I said, well, who wrote it? And they said, Andy Grove. And I was completely shocked. I said, Andy Grove, like the Andy Grove, took time out from running Intel to write a book that is going to teach me how to manage and how to be a leader? And they're like, yes, you have to get it. And you have to understand, at this time, Intel was the company, not just in Silicon Valley, but in technology. It was completely legendary and had gotten to its perch on top of the industry, not through like one lucky idea or like a burst of inspiration that just carried it, but through an amazing story. They were one of Silicon Valley's very first startups, and through the years, they had to completely change their business under Andy from being in the memory business, which was under incredible attack, not just by Japanese business competitors, but by the Japanese government itself funding those competitors, to underprice Intel, which forced it very late in its life to switch into the microprocessor business, which ended up being a far bigger business than the memory business ever was. And, it became like the company, and at the helm was Andy. And Andy was the legendary figure of all times in Silicon Valley, and a lot of it came from where he started. So we all knew that he came from Budapest, Hungary. And he came from Budapest, Hungary as a Jew. Budapest! As a Jew, at a time when first the Nazis, then the Soviet communists occupied Hungary, and his family was threatened, and he was threatened to the point where, even as one of the most promising students in Budapest, he had to escape and leave the country. And there were all kinds of great stories in Silicon Valley about how he did that, and a lot of them probably weren't true, about leaping over barbed wire fences and throwing grenades at Russian tanks and whatnot. But what was true is, as a teenager, he got on a boat by himself and sailed on a very long journey, scary journey, to New York. And he arrived in New York as a kid with no money, no other people around him, and really almost no knowledge of English, and enrolled himself in CCNY. Took physics, probably the hardest first class you could imagine, particularly if you didn't know English. Immediately flunked his first test because he didn't know English, but then learned English and physics, and got an A on the next test, and went on to get a PhD in physics from UC Berkeley, and then write a book on semiconductors that ended up being a very important book in English. And then he launched Intel and became CEO of Intel, and this was the guy who had built that company, and you saw he was Time Magazine Man of the Year in 1997 because of his impossible and amazing journey. And he had written this book, not a book about how great he was or how great Intel was or any of those things, but a book that was just like, here's how you manage. And so I was so excited to get the book. I got the book. And as soon as I looked at the cover, I stepped back. I had to look at it again because on the cover of management books in those days, what you always saw was like a CEO with perfectly combed hair and a suit and arms folded, and it looked like guys flew in from Hollywood to take the picture and all that. But on Andy's book, he's dressed for work. He's in front of the Intel sign, and hanging from his belt is his key card. And I do a double take. I'm like, he didn't take his key card off for the cover of the book? That's amazing. He was so ready to go back to work, he didn't even take his key card off. But in retrospect, that cover was perfect because Andy Grove was all substance. And he wrote that book for us to teach us how to run our organizations better. But if we needed a fancy cover to read it, that was our loss. And this book wasn't for people who wanted to look the part. This book was for the people who wanted to live the part. And when I read it, it was so amazing as a management book because it connected not just intellectually, but emotionally with what the whole thing was about. And reading it, you could just feel what he wanted you to learn. And he did it by exposing, even as the most important guy in the whole industry, his own vulnerabilities. You could see that he knew what was hard about it. There's a great passage in the book where he talks about, when people come late for a meeting, and you know that that's not good because it's going to waste everybody's time in the room. But what you don't know as a young manager is how do you deal with that person when they come in the room? Because it's a very awkward situation. And Andy Grove, Andy went through and he explained what it feels like, how to deal with it. And you knew that he felt that, and he had to think through, okay, this is why I'm going to tell that person they can't be late. And it was just such an amazing feeling, and it was one of those books where when you read it, he put so much of himself into it that after finishing it, I felt like I knew him better than people who I actually knew. And so after reading it, maybe 6 or 7 years later, my now business partner, Mark Andreessen, comes to me and says, "Hey, Ben, would you like to meet Andy Grove?" And I was, of course, freaking out. I was like, oh, my God, Andy Grove. I can't believe it. I was still the most excited I've ever been to meet anybody in my life. And, when you get something like that, the next thing you have to think of is, well, what am I going to say? And I thought, well, the one thing I'm definitely going to say is I'm going to tell him how much I like the book. So we go in for the meeting, and first sentence out of my mouth, "Andy, I loved your book. It's my favorite book I've ever read." And he looked at me and he said, "Why?" And I totally didn't expect that. I was expecting "Thank you, so honored, it's awesome." But he's, "Why?" And I should have expected it because that was Andy. He was always teaching, and he was always expecting more from every student of his. And so, but there I was, flipping through my mind, why, I got to come up with an answer because otherwise he's going to think I didn't even read the book. And I finally said, well, every management book I've read, they just deal with these trivial things that I could have figured out myself. But your book deals with the real issues. And, and he looked at me, and you could kind of see his face soften, and he was like, okay, that's okay. And those of you who know Andy probably have had this experience many times. The conversation kind of went on, and then he said, Ben, that thing that you were saying about management books, he said, it's interesting because I recently ran out of space on my bookshelf at home. And I thought to myself, should I buy a bigger house or should I get rid of some books? And I thought, easy decision. But which books to get rid of? And then I thought, the management books. But I had this problem, which is almost every management book that I had was given to me by the author. And the author had inscribed a very nice note to me about how I might have helped them or something, and I felt horrible throwing away these notes. So what I did was I opened up each book, I tore out the page with the inscription, and put it to the side, and I threw out the book. And so now I have this nice stack of very nice inscriptions and plenty of space on my shelf for good books. And that story, I don't know that anybody other than Andy Grove would have a story like that because that was him. He had such high expectations and high standards for all his students. He wanted only the greatest. But at the same time, he had an undying belief in the underlying person. So, yeah, you had to be good to make it onto Andy Grove's bookshelf. You had to be great. You had to work. You had to earn your way up there. But even if you didn't make it, it still meant something to him that you wrote him that nice note and that you really tried and you wanted him to have the book. And maybe one day you'd make it onto the bookshelf. And it's just something that is so powerful to expect so much of people, but yet to care about them that much. And you almost never see it. And he's such a special person for that. And we're here today to honor Andy, and I think that the best way to honor him is to live up to his standard, or to try to live up to his standard. And that means when we see someone who comes to us with nothing, who just wants to do something, we need to help them. But we need to help them with a high expectation of not only what they're going to do, but who they're going to help. And even if they don't make it, it's so important that they know that we still care about them. And even more important than that, if a political refugee happens to show up on our shores, we need to embrace her with everything we have because she may be the next Andy Grove. Thank you. And can you play the video? Can you see the next video?
Andy Grove is the quintessential manager of our time. He is absolutely the best.
Above all else, he's an extraordinarily inspirational figure, one of the most influential people of our time, I would say. If he takes something on, he does it with all his heart and soul.
I think Andy built Silicon Valley. Kind of, if you pick one person who built Silicon Valley, it was Andy, and some of that had to do with the role that Intel played. Andy kind of exemplifies the best of Silicon Valley, and Andy kind of set the model for what a high-quality Silicon Valley company could be.
I think he's one of the men who's made this great Silicon Valley, and without a doubt, responsible for the most important high-technology company ever.
I was very surprised when I met Andy and seeing a warm and caring, very inspirational human being come into my office, and by the time he left my office, we were hugging.
I first met Andy after a series of pretty hard times at Facebook when a lot of people in his position wouldn't take the time to see me, and he was always so generous.
I couldn't believe it when we were finally set up for lunch and we went down, so I was like a little bit of a fanboy and trying to hide it. He was familiar with Dropbox, and he gave me a little bit of a grilling about us and the cloud and the NSA and things like that, so he was very direct, which wasn't surprising, but we had a great conversation.
It's a little bit like, somebody saying, boy, you should ask Jesus if if he'll see you once a quarter or something like that.
I became the CEO of Intuit. I asked him if he could help me a little bit. And he volunteered the time to come to my office and sit down and talk to me a number of times. And he told me about those things that he felt were important. He made such a big deal. If I trained my managers, my company would be better.
I really have enormous appreciation for Andy's perspective. I've very much appreciated that he's taken me under his wing as a mentor in doing something like this that is so big and different from the types of things that I've done in the past.
We wrote a case study, which is still being used, by the way, here as well as at Harvard Business School. When the first time he came to my class, right? So that was, he told me, I like to come and see once how it goes. So you bring in some guy like Grove, and you might lose control of your class in no time. And I told him, in the class, I am the boss. If you come and teach with me, I didn't tell you're the boss, but in my class, I am the boss. So if you challenge me, I'm going to challenge you. And you know, for 40 years we have done it. We've actually done it.
He wills with every fiber of his being for the success of the organization. He had the same kind of way that Steve Jobs did of getting really high performance out of people.
His book really played a big role in shaping my management style as well. My wife just finished her residency program and is now a new entrepreneur. And when she started and asked me what she should do to learn, reading his book was my only real suggestion.
I'm just really grateful that he's taken the time to put all this down in writing. He acknowledges reality and doesn't oversimplify things. Just every year I find myself coming back to a lot of the lessons that he's written down.
His high output management book is a Bible that every entrepreneur, every manager in the country should look at, read and understand, and make sure that they can apply those principles.
If I had to pick one word to describe Andy, it would be builder. And I mean that both as a builder of technology, but also as a builder of companies and a builder of cultures.
Andy is ruthlessly intellectually honest, kind of a cross between a father and a mentor and a hero.
He was very loyal to Intel. He was loyal to UCSF, and he's a loyal friend, I know. And yet, for all he's achieved, he's an unassuming individual.
I've seldom come across people who have that ability to be so clear and then, based on that insight, to take action.
He's confident and vulnerable at the same time, and I think that's probably why he's been an amazing leader in so many different arenas. He's a very forthright and lovely man.
Ladies and gentlemen, Andy Grove. Oh, yes, absolutely.
One item, food for thought, as we sit here and go through what each of us have done, our colleagues have done, my contemporaries have done. Let's remember, that millions of young people who had the misfortune of being born in the wrong national boundaries are going through all the horrors that Ben described. I had to. I made it. Let's try in a little way to help them.